This one comes from Nate. I've been reading Tactics and I'm really enjoying it. I was just wondering, though, it seems like it's designed to react to something someone says, whether in conversation already or something you overheard or observed about them. But how do you get in conversation with someone to begin with?
Yeah, I have that question a lot, and he's right. The tactical game plan largely is most effective when others are making claims against you as a Christian or making some claims about some spiritual thing. So I have this waitress, and she says, "Oh, the universe takes care of me." Well, what does that mean? And so I got to ask, what do you mean by that, basically? And there's a whole conversation we had. It's in the new book, by the way. It's an interesting conversation we had. But it was initiated because somebody else made the comment. And I get asked, well, how do you get into conversations of a spiritual nature if the other person isn't asking? I think that's the sense of the question. And that's quite a bit more difficult. Now, some people are much more aggressive in this than I am, and it isn't like I have all these clever ways of introducing spiritual things. I have one suggestion that I'll make, and I actually got it from J. Warner Wallace, and I think he got it from somebody else. But he used it at a reality once in one of his talks, and I thought, hey, that's a good one. That's a keeper. So I'll tell that in a moment. But I realized that there are times when I'm talking to other people about just whatever, and I'm thinking, well, how can I kind of turn a corner with this a little bit? And I end up saying something that is not at all clever. I'm just trying to say something. Well, people are complaining about politics or something. I said, that's why it's good that this isn't the only world that we have access to, that this life isn't the only life there is. Oh, well, that's not very profound, And they might say, what are you talking about? Or I'll just throw out something, and all it is a little bit of chum, if you're using a fishing example, where you're throwing out stuff in the water and see if any fish come around and start nibbling at it, And that's all I'm doing. I'm just thinking, well, if I just kind of breach some aspect of the topic, at least there's something for the Holy Spirit to work with. And it just may be that a person has been thinking about these things and that I mention it. They might say, I've really been thinking about this. This happened once on an airplane, and a gentleman sat next to me, and I didn't, I didn't want to get into a spiritual conversation, and I didn't think I could relate to him. He's a young guy, and whatever. He's a different cultural slice than me, and but within a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes of just making small talk, and that's part of this, just making small talk, showing an interest in people. We ended up talking about spiritual things, and I'm not exactly sure how we got into it, but I must have said something, and what his response to me was, it really shocked me. He says, I've been thinking a lot about those things lately. In other words, I've been thinking about spiritual things. And so the fact that I just broached something spiritual gave him something to respond to, and the Holy Spirit to then begin to use in moving the conversation. Once it's moving, for me, it's a lot easier. But I think getting into these conversations, initiating them, is a little bit harder. Sometimes I'll ask questions about, just like the witch in Wisconsin, about the jewelry she was wearing, and it was a pentagram and a cultic symbol. Turns out she was a witch. Sometimes it's a book somebody's reading that seems to have spiritual implications. And I'm thinking about the airplane right now, and I'll ask them, hey, is that book good? Yeah, it was a New Agey book. And I said, they talk about Jesus in that book? Oh, yeah, they talk about a lot. I said, have you ever read Jesus for yourself? In other words, have you ever read the primary source documentation about Jesus and not some New Ager's twist on it? Well, it turned out that little conversation went absolutely nowhere, fell right on its face, and the guy wasn't even interested in talking. What do you mean I read Jesus? I said, like in the Gospels. No, I don't read that stuff. And then it was clear he wanted to get back to his reading, and he didn't want to talk to me. Okay, well, I just took a shot. So the point I'm making is sometimes you just do something, you throw something out and see if it sticks. And you don't try not to sound too weird and not to sound certainly not abrupt or unpleasant or unkind or anything like that, but something to kind of, especially if it doesn't have to do with some kind of ethical issue, like,
what do you think about abortion?
Yeah, or something like that. Abortionists are going to hell. Then this is just. But if you talk about the human condition, refer to that. So, first point is, that's not always easy, and sometimes for me it's just silly. It's just hokey, I think. But that sometimes it works. It gives God something to work with. So I'll take a step and try to introduce some concept, but I have nothing that's really clever, some standard way of doing this, all right? But I was going to suggest what Jay Warner shared once at a reality in one of his talks, and here's the question you can ask, but I'll just role play it as if I were asking someone so someone could see how this would lead into it. If you're having a conversation with somebody, maybe someone you know or somebody you just met but you're conversing, here's what you could say. Do you mind if I ask you a question? I mean, it's kind of a personal question. If you don't want to answer, that's all right too. But I've just been thinking about something. I'm curious about your opinion. What do you think? No, go ahead. Ask it. Okay, great. Here's the question that I've been thinking about. All right. What do you think happens when you die? What do you think happens when you die? There you go. Okay, that's spiritual category. You're just getting somebody's opinion. You let them talk. You don't want to make it sound like I'm just asking this so I can pound you with my Bible. Okay, you want to hear what they have to say. So that is a kind of a what do you mean by that, even though they haven't said anything yet. So you're getting information, you're gathering information about maybe their spiritual view, about something that's really significant that has crossed everybody's mind at some point. What happens when you die? What do you think happens? Now, if they say, I don't know, and I don't know how anybody can know, I'm going to ask, why would you think nobody could know that? There is a response to their comment, but it's a question, and I want them to talk. And then partly in my own mind, I'm thinking, well, I might try to lead to, if there was somebody who came back from the dead, maybe what that person had to say might be significant. So this relates to NDEs, near-death experiences, and it also introduces the concept of the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus didn't have a near-death experience. He was dead 3 days in the grave, He was packed with 75 pounds of spices. He was, already being mummified, and he walks out of the grave. Now, that might be a point of contention for them, but this is something I introduced. Well, if it turned out that someone like Jesus actually rose from the dead, and he was dead as a doornail, kind of dead, would that have any implications for the answer to that question? Notice, I'm now introducing Jesus, but I'm doing it with a question, tossing the ball in their court. Now, if they say, well, I think I'm going to heaven, or I think that I'm going to be reincarnated, or whatever opinion they give about what they think is going to happen, now it's appropriate to say, I'm curious, why do you think that's what's going to happen? All you're doing is gathering information. You're just being a student of somebody else's view at this point. And just staying a student and asking these questions can have a significant impact on somebody. Because I've seen it happen. Even if you're not taking the initiative to kind of preach in some way, your own view. That's the third step of Columbo, using questions to make a point. But if you're using it, and like with this question, you can make a lot of progress, it seems to me, without being particularly clever, just employing your first two Columbo maneuvers and the first two Columbo questions. Now, when I say make a lot of progress, I mean you can move a conversation forward and discuss spiritual things. I don't know if that person is going to be responsive in a positive way to what you have to say or will reject it ultimately. That's up to the Holy Spirit. I'm trying to do what I can to move the conversation productively forward, and then that's motion that God can work with. That's the way I picture it. But if there's no motion, if I'm not doing anything, then there's very little for God to work with, for the Holy Spirit to enter into, so to speak. But if I can get this going and I have a conversation, then it's a little different situation.
I really like your idea about the question about, or your comment about that's why I'm glad this isn't the only life, or that there's another life. The reason why I think that's a really good one is because people are often talking about things that have gone wrong lately. This is no matter what a person's political views, their conversation will eventually turn to something that they think is going wrong.
Sure.
And so, and along those lines, it just occurred to me that maybe a comment about justice would also work, and say, well, that's why I'm glad that there's going to be an ultimate justice. Like, what do you think? Do you think that? Like, what do you think about that?
One day justice is going to be done. It certainly isn't done here.
Yeah.
And one day it will be. And of course, Lewis has talked about this. And so, I mean, I think that's a great.
So justice comes up a lot, and that's something that we can start a conversation about, because how do you ground justice? How do you think it's going to happen? Will it happen? Do you hope it will happen? That's something that people are desiring that we can offer with Christianity.
Well, something else that Lewis pointed out, and I'm kind of reading back through Weight of Glory, which is a collection of essays, and I'm not sure which particular essay. It might have been Weight of Glory. It might be Transposition. There's a number of them in there. But it's a very interesting point. I'd never even thought about it before, that what we are teaching people is that, look at this, as you mentioned, this life is not the only life. This life is a preparation for the true utopia, heaven, and we're moving towards that. And secularists think this is the life where that's going to happen. But what the point he made that was interesting is even secularists say that it's not now, but it's in the future. Look at what we can build. Every politician, we're going to even Make America Great Again. Somewhere in the future, we work now so that we can have something better in the future. Nothing wrong with those kinds of things, but even in a secular sense, utopia is always out there somewhere that we're moving toward, but we never, ever get there. Not in this life. It's such a great observation, because I hadn't thought of it that way. But our worldview is completely consistent with that. We can work to make our lives better, knowing that ultimately this life is nothing in this life is ever going to satisfy. I just started reading Ecclesiastes. I read 3 chapters. It's very slowly and more thoughtfully, much more, I think, than I have in the past. It was very interesting, those first 3 chapters, vanity on vanities. This life, no matter what, is not going to ultimately satisfy. And we go to the dust. Well, we realize that going to the dust is the end of this life, but it's not the end of life. And so these are all details that could factor in to a conversation with other people.
The idea of hope, the idea of fulfillment,
right.
Both are things people are looking for. You could ask them, how do you keep going when you're discouraged? What is your goal? What are you heading towards? I don't know. There's all sorts of things, but right now people are talking about bigger issues, bigger ideas, justice and hope and goodness and badness, and all these things help us in our conversations, and they will come up.
Well, I'll be the first to admit, and I have already, I'm not, that is not my strong point, okay? Once we're into things, I can kind of work things out, think of questions, but this one isn't a strong point for me. Other people have their own ways of doing it, and there's my suggestion that I got from Jim, who got it from somebody else. I think that's one option, but think about things yourself, how you might bring these things up and question people. I think what's really valuable here is forget about preaching. Think about engaging in conversation on critical issues and how do people solve these things. Do you want to know what I think is going to happen? So you have this conversation. Are you interested in hearing my opinion of how this works out? This isn't the only life we live, okay? This is preparation for another life, okay? And that would be, I'd move into the Christian worldview. The problem is, though, we're going to have to give an account, and that's not a pretty picture.
Well, that's the second part of the justice thing. Yeah, justice is great until you realize it's also going to apply to you.
Right, that's right. That's right. And these are concepts I develop in the story Reality towards the end of the book. So
a friend of mine who works in the film industry also has a question that he often asks, and I think it's a good one. He has some form of the question, hey, what did you do last weekend? And then he will move into the idea of, did you go to church? Did you used to go to church when you were young? Or you could move to say, I went to church. Oh yeah, did you go to church? Or did you used to go to church? What's your experience with that?
Why don't you anymore? Or something like that. What I find, that's a really good one. And I find sometimes when I get in these conversations, I'm talking with disaffected Christians. Oh, yeah, I used to go and blah, blah, blah. There's a waitress. Where was I? I can't even remember. But it was after an event. We went out to get a bite to eat, a TGI Fridays or something like that. They're open till 11, so one of the few places that after 10 o'clock. And, I used to go, and this waitress says it. And I don't know, just really boldly, we were talking to being real friendly and everything. And I said, Kristen, I'll just give her a name. Kristen, Jesus still wants you. Jesus still wants you. You need him. I just said something like that, but I looked her right in the face. It was very confidently. And so I knew that she had a Christian upbringing in her family. Now she's a young adult and she's attracted by a whole bunch of other things and doesn't have time for that. And maybe I would have said, and you need him too. I don't know, just something very simple, but it was a straightforward, confident statement to a person that had a Christian background and understood what I was talking about, and I just let it sit there.
Greg, when you said, gosh, this brings so many ideas to mind, because when you said that she's distracted by other things, I think about how young people still think the world's going to make them happy. And like you were saying in Ecclesiastes, it takes a while for them to figure that out. So maybe when they're younger, you got to plant that idea. They have to find out for themselves that these things are not going to make them happy.
Right.
Maybe it's better when you get to someone who's more middle-aged and they start to realize that the world is not going to make them happy. They're not going to find fulfillment here. They're not going to have ultimate fulfillment. It's kind of a shock when people realize that. So the older the person, the more kind of, I think, you'll have.
Vulnerable
Yes.
They will be to life's, the contingencies of life. And young people don't think they'll ever die. I remember when I was in college at Michigan State University in the early 70s, and I like Simon and Garfunkel, that's no secret, but there was a line in one of their songs, it's called Bookends. It's about growing old. And they were, at the time, they both were in their 20s. And the line was, how terribly strange to be 70. It was beautifully written and done, this music. Old Friends is the name of the piece. Two guys sitting on a bench, old guys kind of quietly sharing the same years. They got the same history, silently sharing the same fear, which is fear of death. Well, I'm 72, and Simon and Garfunkel, they're ancient. They're still alive, but you see pictures, you can't even recognize them, just like a lot of old people compared to when they were in their 20s. But young people don't think about that. That's 70? Are you kidding me? I can't even count that high, kind of thing, until of their friends is taken like that, an accident, disease, and all of a sudden their mortality descends upon them, the sense of their mortality. So sometimes those are times to take advantage of things. We don't know when we're going to go.